Close your eyes for a moment and picture a foggy London morning in the last days of February, 1932. Somewhere in a quiet, tree-lined corner of Hampstead, a baby girl is being born into a household that smells faintly of oil paint and old books. Nobody in that room has any idea that this particular infant will grow up to be photographed more times than almost any human being in history. Nobody knows that her face will end up on magazine covers on 6 continents, that her name will become a byword for glamour, for scandal, for heartbreak, and eventually for extraordinary courage. Right now she is just a baby, small, healthy, and, even in that very first hour of life, already possessing something strange and unforgettable, a pair of eyes that would later be described as violet, though technically they were nothing of the sort. Tonight, we're going to spend the next several hours drifting slowly through the full sweep of her life. Not the tabloid version, not the perfume bottle version, but the long, human, complicated story underneath it. We'll start in that foggy London nursery, travel across an ocean to sun-bleached Los Angeles, sit quietly beside a horse named King Charles, watch a plane vanish into a New Mexico storm, stand in the crowd outside the Vatican's disapproving press office, and eventually find ourselves in a hospital room in Los Angeles in the year 2011. It is a very long journey. So get comfortable, dim the lights if you like, and let's begin at the very beginning in a quiet house in Hampstead on an ordinary winter day that turned out not to be ordinary at all. Her name at birth was Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor, though of course nobody called a newborn by her full name for very long. Her parents, Francis and Sarah Taylor, were both Americans, but they had built their life in London. Francis worked as an art dealer, running a gallery that catered to a moneyed, cultured clientele, the kind of people who bought paintings the way other people bought groceries, as a simple matter of taste and habit. Sarah had a different history. Before she became Mrs. Taylor, before she became a mother, she had been a stage actress, performing under the name Sarah Southern. She had walked away from that career when she married, trading the footlights for domestic life. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment, because it will echo through everything that follows. A woman who once wanted very badly to perform, who gave it up, and who would spend years afterward finding new and often intense ways to bring performance back into her life. This time, through her daughter. Elizabeth's early childhood in London was comfortable in the particular way that only a certain kind of upper-middle-class artistic household can be comfortable. There were gallery openings and visiting collectors. There was an older brother, Howard, born a few years before her. There was, by most accounts, a good deal of affection in the house, alongside the kind of formality that era and that class expected. Children were seen, admired briefly, and then returned to the care of nannies while the grown-ups continued their conversations about art and money. But even inside that ordinary domestic scene, something extraordinary was becoming impossible to ignore. Elizabeth had been born with a rare genetic condition called distichiasis, a mild, mostly harmless mutation that causes an extra row of eyelashes to grow along the eyelid. In a modern ophthalmologist's office, this is a minor curiosity, noted in a file and occasionally monitored. In a household full of visiting artists and photographers in the 1930s, it looked like something closer to a miracle. Her lashes were thick and doubled, framing eyes that shifted color depending on the light, a deep, saturated blue that under the right conditions seemed to tip over into violet. People who met her as a small child would later swear, with complete sincerity, that no infant had ever had eyes like that. Some accused her, absurdly, of wearing makeup. She was 2 years old. We'll come back to the science behind those famous eyes a little later, because it deserves its own careful unpacking. For now, it's enough to say that from her very first months of life, Elizabeth Taylor was already being looked at in a way most children never are. Adults leaned in a little closer. Photographers who visited the gallery lingered a little longer over the family's youngest member. It wasn't fame yet. She was nobody, a toddler in a private London home, but it was the seed of something. A face that the world would eventually find impossible to look away from was already, quietly, doing its work. Sarah Taylor noticed all of this more intensely than anyone else in the house. She had once stood on a stage herself, had once known what it felt like to have an audience's attention resting entirely on her, and she recognized in her small daughter something she had lost and clearly still longed for. Long before Elizabeth could read a full sentence, she was enrolled in dance classes. She was dressed carefully for visitors. She was, by several accounts, presented to members of the royal family as a very small child during a charity function, curtsying on cue while her mother watched from just out of frame, glowing with a pride that had at least as much to do with her own unfinished dreams as with her daughter's talent. None of this, of course, meant anything to Elizabeth herself. She was a small child in a warm house, loved by her parents, mildly aware that grown-ups seemed unusually interested in her, but with no concept whatsoever of what any of it might eventually add up to. She could not have known that her mother's quiet, persistent ambition on her behalf was the opening movement of a story that would run for the next 8 decades. She simply lived, the way small children do, inside the narrow, comfortable present tense of being 7, then 6, then 5 years old, surrounded by people who loved her, and by a city she assumed she would always call home. That assumption did not survive very long. By the end of the 1930s, Europe was sliding toward war, and Americans living abroad were being strongly urged to bring their families home. For the Taylors, home meant the United States, and specifically, given Francis's professional connections and Sarah's old theatrical ambitions, it meant Los Angeles. In the spring of 1939, the family boarded a ship and crossed the Atlantic, leaving behind the foggy streets of Hampstead for a city that could not have been more different. Bright, sprawling, dry, and absolutely saturated with the business of making movies. She was 7 years old when she first saw Los Angeles, and it is difficult to imagine a more consequential accident of geography. The family did not simply move to America. They moved into the immediate orbit of the film industry itself, settling in an area where neighbors, family, friends, and gallery clients were as likely to be studio executives as they were art collectors. For a mother who had once dreamed of the stage, and who now found herself living a short drive from the largest dream factory on earth, the temptation must have been almost impossible to resist. We'll pick up the story there, with a small English girl blinking in the California sunshine, about to be discovered by a business that had been quietly waiting for exactly this kind of face. Los Angeles in 1939 was not simply a city. It was an industry wearing the disguise of a city. Every other person you might meet at a dinner party, at a church function, at a child's birthday celebration, seemed to have some connection to the studios. A cousin who worked in wardrobe, a neighbor who was a casting director, a friend of a friend who could get you in a room with the right executive. For most families arriving fresh from England, this would have meant nothing at all. For the Taylors, it meant everything because they had, quite by accident, brought with them the one commodity this town valued above all others: a strikingly beautiful child with an equally determined mother standing behind her. Sarah Taylor did not waste time. She understood, with the instincts of a woman who had once stood in front of an audience herself, exactly what she was sitting on. She began mentioning her daughter's looks to the right people, at the right gatherings in the careful, apparently offhand way that experienced stage mothers have always known how to do. Meanwhile, Frances Taylor's gallery continued attracting wealthy clients, some of whom had genuine industry connections. It was, in the end, one of these connections, a family friend with ties to a studio executive, that led to Elizabeth's first screen test. She was barely 9 years old. She did not fully understand what a screen test was, only that she was being asked to sit in front of a camera and look toward the light while adults she didn't know studied her face with great seriousness. What they saw astonished them. The camera, it turned out, loved her every bit as much as the people at dinner parties had. Her first film role came in 1942 in a minor, largely forgettable picture called There's One Born Every Minute. It made no particular impact on audiences and is remembered today mainly as a footnote. the first time the world saw Elizabeth Taylor on a screen. But it did exactly what it needed to do. It proved she could perform in front of a camera without freezing, without self-consciousness, without the awkwardness that so often derails child actors. And it caught the attention of the biggest studio in the business, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Signing with MGM in the early 1940s was not like accepting an ordinary job, even for an adult, and it was even less like an ordinary arrangement for a 9-year-old. The studio contract system of that era gave the studio an extraordinary degree of control over a performer's entire existence. Their schedule, their appearance, their public behavior, even in many documented cases, who they were seen dating, and what stories were allowed to circulate about their private lives. For a child, this meant something close to complete surrender of ordinary childhood. Elizabeth's days now belonged, in a very real legal and practical sense, to a corporation. She attended the small schoolhouse MGM maintained on its lot for its stable of child performers, a school where lessons were scheduled around filming rather than the other way around. Between classes, there were wardrobe fittings, publicity photographs, coaching sessions on how to walk, how to smile for a specific angle, how to hit a mark on the floor without looking down to find it. It is worth pausing on how strange this actually was. An ordinary 9-year-old spends her days losing teeth, scraping knees, and inventing games with the neighborhood kids. Elizabeth spent her surrounded by adults whose livelihoods depended on her performance, adults who adjusted studio lighting to flatter her face, and who studied her expressions with the seriousness of engineers testing a new machine. She was, at once, treated as a precious and delicate object, and as a piece of extremely valuable equipment. None of this would have mattered much to film history if she hadn't also turned out to be genuinely talented. MGM had gambled on a beautiful child and discovered, somewhat to its own surprise, that she could act. What the studio needed now was the right vehicle, a story built to showcase exactly what this particular child could do. That vehicle arrived in 1944, and it had 4 legs. National Velvet told the story of a young English girl who trains a spirited, unpredictable horse to compete in the Grand National Steeplechase. Elizabeth was cast as Velvet Brown, and the role required something the studio had not initially been sure she could deliver: physical courage. The producers were reportedly hesitant at first, feeling that Elizabeth, at 12, was too small and too slight to be convincing on horseback in a role that demanded real riding. According to accounts from the period, rather than accepting that judgment, Elizabeth threw herself into months of intensive riding lessons and physical conditioning, determined to prove she could handle the part physically as well as emotionally. Whether or not she genuinely willed herself taller, as the more colorful version of the story likes to claim, she certainly willed herself capable. The studio relented, and she got the role. She insisted on doing a substantial portion of her own writing during filming, a decision that gave the film an authenticity audiences responded to immediately, and a decision that came at a real physical cost. During production, she suffered a fall from her horse and injured her back. At the time, it was treated as a minor incident, the kind of thing a resilient 12-year-old shakes off within a few days. In hindsight, it marked the beginning of a lifetime of chronic back problems that would eventually require multiple surgeries and contribute, decades later, to a dependency on prescription painkillers. The film that made her a star also, quietly and almost invisibly, began the slow work of breaking her body. It's a pattern that would repeat again and again across her life, her greatest triumphs and her deepest wounds arriving, disturbingly often, in exactly the same package. National Velvet was a massive success. Audiences fell in love with her instantly, and critics, who might easily have dismissed a pretty child reciting lines, found themselves genuinely moved by her performance. Almost overnight, Elizabeth went from a promising contract player to one of the most beloved young stars in the country. MGM, sensing exactly what it now possessed, had no intention of letting her remain an ordinary child a moment longer than necessary. What followed was years of a particular kind of managed existence that is difficult to fully convey to anyone who didn't live through the old studio system. MGM's publicity department did not simply promote its stars, it constructed them. Biographical details could be smoothed over, invented, or quietly buried depending on what served the box office. Elizabeth's outings, her friendships, even her early romantic interests were arranged, at least in part, with an eye toward what would generate favorable headlines. Her weight and appearance were monitored constantly, an early and formative lesson that her body was, in some fundamental sense, a matter of professional concern to people who had never sat across from her at a family dinner. The money involved was staggering for the era, and yet the person actually generating it had remarkably little control over it. Earnings flowed through parents, agents, and studio contracts, leaving the young star herself simultaneously one of the most valuable people on the lot and one of the least powerful. It's a strange dynamic to sit with, a girl earning a fortune for other people while having almost no say over her own daily life. Much of this was dressed up sincerely as care. The studio did want its young stars healthy and well cared for, the way a stable wants its prize horses well fed and uninjured. But it was the care one extends to a valuable asset, not the unconditional care a child receives simply for being a child. The distinction is subtle, and it left a mark. Having spent her formative years with her image, her schedule, and her very identity controlled by other people, Elizabeth developed, as she grew older, an almost ferocious hunger to control her own choices, especially, as we'll see again and again, in matters of love. As she moved through adolescence, MGM did something that Hollywood has done to countless child stars before and since, usually with disastrous results. It rushed her into adult roles well before she had actually lived through an ordinary adolescence. By her mid-teens, she was being photographed in gowns and jewelry, styled and marketed as a glamorous young woman rather than a teenage girl still working through algebra homework between takes. It was, in commercial terms, an enormously successful strategy. Most child stars fail to survive the transition to adult roles, and Elizabeth's unusual gift, a face that seemed only to grow more striking with age, made the shift profitable rather than career-ending. But there was a real human cost buried inside that commercial success. She was, in effect, asked to perform sophisticated adulthood at an age when most people are mainly preoccupied with friendships, homework, and the ordinary confusion of growing up. The gap between how old she appeared to be and how old she actually was grew wider every year, and it left her, by the time she reached genuine adulthood, having skipped over a great many of the ordinary trial-and-error lessons that most people quietly learn in their teens and early 20s. Lessons about judging character, about testing relationships slowly, about simply being allowed to make small mistakes in private rather than under a spotlight. This matters enormously for what comes next, because it goes a long way toward explaining the pattern that would come to define so much of her adult life. A woman who moved into serious, life-altering romantic decisions with startling speed, again and again, often in full public view. She had been trained since early childhood to perform love and glamour convincingly on screen. She had almost never been permitted to simply practice ordinary human relationships in private. And so, at 18 years old, having grown up almost entirely inside a studio's carefully managed fiction, Elizabeth Taylor was about to make the first of 8 walks down the aisle. In May of 1950, Elizabeth Taylor walked down an aisle for the first time. She was 18 years old, and the man waiting for her was Conrad Hilton Jr., known to nearly everyone as Nicky, the young heir to the Hilton Hotel fortune. On paper, and certainly in every photograph the newspapers rushed to print, it looked like precisely the fairy tale a young star was supposed to have. A beautiful actress marrying a handsome, wealthy young man from one of the country's most famous families. The wedding itself was a lavish, heavily publicized affair, attended by a significant portion of Hollywood's elite, and covered with the kind of breathless enthusiasm that only a genuine celebrity wedding could generate in that era. Elizabeth, dressed in a gown that would later be almost as famous as the marriage itself, appeared to be stepping directly into a life of guaranteed happiness. The reality, it turned out, bore almost no resemblance to the photographs. Away from the cameras, Nicky Hilton had a serious drinking problem, and by multiple later accounts, he was also prone to volatile and at times frightening behavior toward his young wife. Their honeymoon, meant to be a grand romantic tour through Europe, instead became, according to Elizabeth's own later recollections, an increasingly bleak and frightening experience for a teenager thousands of miles from anyone she could turn to for help. Whatever illusion she had carried down the aisle began dissolving almost immediately. It's worth pausing here to consider exactly how unprepared she was for any of this. Elizabeth had spent her entire adolescence inside a studio system that stage-managed her public romances for maximum publicity value, a system that had taught her, in effect, to perform the appearance of love convincingly rather than to develop any real judgment about the character of the people she was involved with. At 18, handed the single largest decision of her young adult life, with a childhood full of manufactured romantic narratives behind her and almost no genuine practical experience to draw on, she made her choice based on the story the marriage seemed to promise rather than on any deep knowledge of the man himself. It is difficult to blame her for this. She had simply never been given the opportunity to learn any differently. The marriage collapsed with remarkable speed. Within less than a year, Elizabeth filed for divorce, becoming, at an unusually young age even by the standards of Hollywood, a divorced woman, a status that carried genuine social stigma in America in the early 1950s, particularly for a woman still so young. The public that had so enthusiastically celebrated the wedding now consumed the news of its failure with a curious mixture of sympathy and appetite for scandal, an early preview of a pattern that would repeat throughout her life. Adoration and condemnation arriving from the very same crowd, sometimes within the same year. There is a particularly telling footnote to this first marriage, one that says a great deal about how completely her private life had become entangled with her professional one. In the very same year that her real marriage to Nicky Hilton was unraveling, Elizabeth happened to be starring in a light comedy called Father of the Bride, a film centered on, of all things, a young woman's wedding. MGM's publicity department, never an organization inclined to let sentiment interfere with a good marketing opportunity, moved quickly to align the timing of Elizabeth's actual wedding with the release of the film. Her real gown, her real ceremony, and her real family were folded directly into the promotional machinery surrounding the movie. Studio executives were present among the wedding guests. Photographs of the real bride circulated in the press alongside promotional stills of her fictional counterpart, blurring, quite deliberately, the line between the film and the life. For the studio, it was an efficient piece of marketing genius. Why manufacture publicity from nothing when a star's actual life could simply be repurposed as free advertising? For Elizabeth, the arrangement carried a much quieter and more corrosive cost. One of the most personal events a person experiences, her own wedding, had not been entirely her own. It belonged, in some meaningful part, to a corporation with a product to sell. She was learning, at 18, a lesson that would echo through the rest of her life, that in her particular world, there might be no such thing as a genuinely private moment, that even her most intimate milestones could be seized, packaged, and sold for profit. This early experience helps explain the fierce, sometimes combative way she would go on to guard her personal choices in later decades, often to the visible frustration of a public that had come to feel oddly entitled to a piece of her. Bruised by the Hilton disaster, and by the discovery that a glamorous wedding guaranteed nothing at all about the years that followed, Elizabeth did not retreat from marriage. Instead, she turned toward something that looked, at least on the surface, like its opposite. In 1952, she married Michael Wilding, a refined, well-regarded British actor some 20 years her senior. Where Nicky Hilton had brought chaos and fear, Wilding brought calm. He was cultured, unflappable, established in his career, and entirely unlike the volatile young heir she had just escaped. After the frightening turbulence of her first marriage, it is not difficult to understand the appeal of a mature, steady, reassuringly gentle man who showed no signs of a dangerous temper or a drinking problem. To a young woman who had just been badly hurt, calm can very easily start to feel like love. The distinction between the two, as she would discover, is something most people only learn the difficult way. For a period, the marriage genuinely delivered on its quiet promise. Elizabeth and Wilding built a home together and welcomed two sons, Michael and Christopher, and by most accounts Elizabeth embraced motherhood with real warmth and sincerity. She seemed, at least from the outside, to be settling into something resembling an ordinary domestic life, as ordinary as any life could be for a woman who could not leave her own house without being photographed. It was a gentler, quieter chapter than what had come immediately before it, and there is every reason to believe she cherished real parts of it. But Elizabeth was changing, and changing quickly, in ways the marriage simply could not keep pace with. She was still remarkably young, still growing rapidly both as a person and as an artist, standing on the edge of the most demanding and important work of her entire career. Her fame was ascending toward its peak. Wilding, meanwhile, was older, further along in his career, which had already begun its slow, ordinary decline. The 20-year age gap that had initially felt like reassuring maturity began, gradually, to feel instead like a widening gulf between a restless young woman full of hunger and ambition and a settled older man who had already reached his professional high point. The marriage did not end in any single dramatic betrayal or public scandal, at least not at first. It ended the way many marriages quietly do, through the slow accumulating drift of two people whose lives were simply moving in different directions at different speeds. They divorced in the mid-1950s, and remarkably, Elizabeth would maintain a lasting personal fondness for Wilding for the rest of her life. One of the very few of her husbands she never spoke of with any real bitterness. It was, in the end, a kind ending to a fundamentally kind marriage, which is its own small mercy in a life that would not always contain many of them. She emerged from this second marriage a more mature woman and a devoted mother, and crucially, an actress standing at the very threshold of her artistic prime. Because even as her personal life continued its restless, complicated pattern, something important and largely separate had been happening to her work. Elizabeth Taylor was, almost despite the wishes of the studio system that had raised her, becoming a genuinely serious actress. In A Place in the Sun, released in 1951, she delivered a performance of such aching vulnerability that critics who had spent years filing her away as simply a beautiful face were forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew about her. Playing a wealthy, luminous young woman caught inside a doomed romance, she was asked, for perhaps the first time in her career, to reach beyond her looks and locate something genuinely felt. She found it. Opposite Montgomery Clift, with whom she would go on to form one of the deepest and most protective friendships of her entire life, she was tender, painfully real, and quietly devastating. It marked the true beginning of the industry's slow, grudging recognition that whatever else Elizabeth Taylor was, she was also, unmistakably, an actress. Her friendship with Montgomery Clift deserves its own careful attention, because it reveals a dimension of her character that no glamour photograph ever managed to capture. Clift was a brilliant, deeply troubled man, wrestling privately with struggles that would eventually contribute to his early death, and Elizabeth loved him fiercely and protectively for the rest of his life. Years after they first worked together, following a dinner party at her home, Clift was involved in a serious car accident just after leaving. According to one of the most extraordinary and frequently retold stories from her life, Elizabeth rushed immediately to the wreckage and, finding him badly injured and in danger of choking on broken teeth and blood, reached directly into his mouth to clear his airway, almost certainly saving his life in that moment. It is not the sort of thing a decorative movie star does. It is the sort of thing a genuinely loyal, deeply brave human being does, and it offers an early glimpse of the fierce protectiveness that would define so many of her most important relationships for the rest of her life. Her next major film, Giant, released in 1956, expanded her range even further. The sprawling Texas epic required her to age convincingly across an entire adult lifetime within a single story, playing opposite two towering figures of the era, Rock Hudson and the young, soon-to-be legendary James Dean. Elizabeth held her own against both of them, earning genuine respect from an industry that had, until quite recently, been fairly content to treat her as decorative. Her friendship with Rock Hudson, forged during that long, sun-scorched Texas shoot, would go on to endure for the rest of his life, and it would eventually come to matter far more than either of them could possibly have imagined on that dusty film set in the mid-1950s. What makes this artistic ascent so genuinely remarkable is that it happened almost entirely in defiance of a studio system that had never particularly needed her to become a great actress. MGM wanted a reliable, beautiful star capable of filling theater seats. It did not require depth, and it certainly hadn't planned for it. Elizabeth became a serious artist anyway, driven by an internal seriousness and ambition that the studio machine had never asked for and, in the end, could not fully control. Critics slowly began speaking of her in an entirely different register, one that had nothing whatsoever to do with her famous eyelashes and everything to do with genuine craft. The pretty child the studio had signed at 9 years old had quietly grown into a formidable performer, capable of real vulnerability, real grandeur, and real emotional truth. She had spent her entire life being underestimated by nearly everyone around her, and film by film, she was in the process of systematically dismantling that underestimation. And just as her artistry was reaching this new level of seriousness, her personal life was about to deliver both the single greatest joy she had yet experienced, and in devastatingly short order afterward, the most painful loss of her young life. Into this rising moment of both personal freedom and artistic triumph walked a man unlike anyone Elizabeth had encountered before. His name was Mike Todd, and he entered her life with the force and noise of a natural disaster in the best possible sense. Todd was a Hollywood producer, brash, flamboyant, wildly ambitious, and utterly convinced of his own genius, a conviction that happened, unusually for such men, to be largely justified. He had made his name and his fortune through sheer force of personality, clawing his way up through the film business until he produced the sprawling, Academy Award-winning epic around the world in 80 days. By the time he met Elizabeth, he was already something of a legend in his own right, a man who treated life itself as the greatest show he had ever staged. In 1957, Elizabeth became his third wife, and by nearly every account that survives from people who knew her at the time, this was the great passionate love of her early adult life. Todd was considerably older than Elizabeth, but the age difference seemed to dissolve almost completely in the face of his sheer vitality. Where Nicky Hilton had brought fear and Michael Wilding had brought a gentle, ultimately mismatched calm, Todd brought something Elizabeth had perhaps never fully experienced before. A man who treated her not as a fragile treasure to be carefully managed, nor as a product to be marketed, but as a genuine equal, a partner in a life meant to be lived at absolutely full volume. The courtship itself was, characteristically for Todd, pure spectacle. He pursued her with an overwhelming, almost theatrical intensity, showering her with extravagant gifts, grand romantic gestures, and an open, unashamed delight in her beauty and her fame that felt entirely different from the way previous men in her life had related to her stardom. He did not compete with her spotlight, and he did not seem intimidated by it either. He simply wanted to make her shine even brighter, and he said so, loudly and often, to anyone who would listen. Their happiness deepened further with the birth of their daughter, Lisa, in 1957. Elizabeth, already a devoted mother to her two sons from her marriage to Wilding, embraced this growing family with what those around her described as genuine, unguarded joy. The couple lived with tremendous extravagance, traveling constantly, appearing everywhere together, an undeniably glittering pair sitting at the absolute center of the film world's attention. Photographs from this brief period show an Elizabeth who looks not merely posed for the camera, but genuinely radiant, lit from somewhere within by a contentment that no amount of skilled studio lighting could ever quite manufacture. By Elizabeth's own later reflection, this stands as one of the happiest periods of her entire life. She had at last found a love that seemed to match the full scale of her own enormous capacity for feeling. It felt, to everyone watching, like the beginning of a long and settled chapter. It was not. Elizabeth Taylor's life had, from the very beginning, an almost cruel tendency to tangle its highest peaks together with its deepest valleys, and this extraordinary happiness had been built, without anyone realizing it, on the very edge of catastrophe. In March of 1958, Mike Todd was scheduled to fly from Los Angeles to New York aboard his private plane, a small aircraft he had, with characteristic sentimentality, named the Lucky Liz in honor of his wife. Elizabeth had originally planned to travel with him, as she so often did, but she had come down with bronchitis in the days before the flight, and Todd, protective of her health, insisted she stay home and rest rather than make the trip. That single decision, made purely out of concern for her well-being, turned out to be the only reason she survived what came next. The plane went down in a severe storm over New Mexico. There were no survivors. Elizabeth, 26 years old, was widowed almost without warning, left with a small daughter not yet a year old, and a grief so total that people who witnessed it later described a kind of complete collapse, one that genuinely frightened those around her. The name of the plane, chosen in a moment of loving sentimentality, now carried an almost unbearable irony. The aircraft named for her luck had killed the man she loved most, while she herself had been spared by nothing more than a bad chest cold. There is a particular, very specific cruelty to grieving in public, and Elizabeth was about to learn that lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. News of the crash reached her without any gentle preparation. There was, in the nature of such tragedies, no soft way for such information to arrive. Photographers captured her stricken, devastated face in the hours and days that followed. The entire world watched a 26-year-old widow fall apart in real time, her private catastrophe converted almost instantly into public entertainment. It is difficult to overstate how disorienting this must have been, to lose the great love of your life in an instant, and to be denied, in that same instant, even the basic dignity of grieving somewhere the cameras couldn't reach. The practical realities compounding her grief were equally staggering. At 26, she was suddenly a widow with 3 young children to raise on her own, including an infant daughter who would grow up never really knowing her father. The joyful, extravagant life she and Todd had built together had vanished almost overnight, and she was left to somehow carry on, because the demands of stardom, and certainly the demands of the studio, showed no particular inclination to pause for anyone's grief. The trauma of losing Todd cut to the very core of who she was, and its aftershocks would echo through the years that immediately followed. In her desperate need for some kind of comfort amid the wreckage of her life, she reached, in her grief, toward the nearest available source of consolation, a decision that would, in a matter of months, transform her from an object of the entire nation's sympathy into the target of its considerable fury. The man she turned to was Eddie Fisher, a popular singer who had been one of Mike Todd's closest friends. In the raw, disorienting weeks and months following the crash, Fisher had been among those who rallied around the grieving widow, offering comfort, companionship, and a living connection to the husband she had so suddenly lost. Under ordinary circumstances, 2 people bound together by shared grief finding solace in each other might have been simply a sad, human, private matter. But the circumstances here were anything but ordinary, because Eddie Fisher was not a free man. He was married to Debbie Reynolds, one of the most beloved and wholesome actresses in America, a woman the public regarded as the very picture of clean-cut, girl-next-door virtue. When it became known that Fisher had left this cherished, popular wife to be with Elizabeth, and the two married in 1959, the public reaction was swift, ferocious, and almost entirely merciless. Elizabeth was branded, more or less overnight, a home wrecker, a scheming seductress who had destroyed a beloved and seemingly happy marriage. The same public that had so recently wept alongside her as a grieving young widow now turned on her with real venom. It was a stunning reversal, and it taught her a hard lesson about the nature of fame. The crowd that adores you and the crowd that despises you are very frequently made up of exactly the same people, and the switch between the two can flip with astonishing speed. There is a genuine unfairness threaded through this entire episode that Elizabeth herself felt keenly, and that is worth acknowledging honestly here. She was a young, grieving widow who had reached, clumsily and imperfectly, for comfort in the aftermath of an almost unimaginable loss. The public, which had been perfectly willing to consume her raw grief as a form of entertainment only months earlier, now consumed her supposed moral failure with an even greater appetite. The same fame that had briefly made her a sympathetic figure now made her an ideal villain, because, as it turns out, a famous villain very often sells even better than a famous victim. The marriage to Fisher, born as it was out of grief and scandal rather than any deep foundation of shared history, was never likely to last, and in time it would run its course entirely. But before that happened, Elizabeth's professional life was about to take an entirely new and historic turn, one that would make her, however briefly, the highest-paid actress in the history of motion pictures. And that would eventually place her on a film set in Rome, standing across from the man who would come to define the rest of her extraordinary life. Amid the ongoing scandal surrounding her marriage to Fisher, an offer arrived from 20th Century Fox so enormous that it would end up reshaping the entire economics of the film industry. The studio wanted Elizabeth for the title role in an epic new production of Cleopatra, and in the negotiations that followed, she reportedly named a figure she assumed was so outrageous it would end the conversation entirely: $1 million, flat, for a single picture. To her genuine astonishment, the studio agreed. It was a staggering sum for the era, and it made her, by most accounts, the first actress in Hollywood history to command $1 million salary for one film. The studio that had once owned her as a 9-year-old contract player was now paying her more than any actress had ever been paid in the entire history of the medium. What followed, however, would turn out to be one of the most famously chaotic productions in the history of cinema. A production so troubled, so expensive, and so consumed by chaos and scandal that it very nearly bankrupted the studio that had agreed to that historic salary in the first place. Cleopatra was conceived from the very beginning as a spectacle on a scale the film industry had never attempted before, and almost from its first day of production, it began spiraling into a legendary slow-motion disaster. Filming began in England, where the damp, unpredictable climate combined badly with Elizabeth's already fragile health, grinding the production to a halt again and again. Enormous, extraordinarily expensive sets were constructed on English soundstages, only to be abandoned entirely as delays piled up on top of delays. Costs mounted at a pace that reportedly left the studio's accountants genuinely alarmed. What had started as an ambitious historical epic was quietly turning into a runaway financial catastrophe that no one seemed able to bring back under control. The sheer scale of the excess involved is almost difficult to take seriously, and it would have been comical if it hadn't been so financially ruinous. The production spared virtually no expense on costumes, sets, and general logistics. Elizabeth alone reportedly wore dozens of separate costumes over the course of filming, some of them woven with actual gold thread. Thousands of extras were employed to recreate the crowded streets of ancient Alexandria and Rome. Elaborate sets rose and fell across multiple countries, Endless reshoots devoured money at a rate that horrified everyone responsible for the studio's finances. Cleopatra was fast becoming, by a wide margin, the most expensive film ever made, and it was nowhere close to finished. Eventually, in a desperate attempt to salvage the entire project, production relocated from England to Rome, a decision made purely for practical and financial reasons that would end up having consequences no studio executive could possibly have anticipated. The budget continued its terrifying climb, eventually reaching a figure so enormous that it genuinely threatened to bankrupt 20th Century Fox as a company. The studio had gambled everything, quite literally, on its million-dollar star and its ancient Egyptian epic, and for a long, harrowing stretch of time, it looked entirely possible that the bet might destroy the studio altogether. Through all of this chaos, Elizabeth remained the fixed, unmoving center of the storm, the reason the entire troubled enterprise existed in the first place, and in the most literal financial sense imaginable, the single most valuable asset on the most expensive film production in the history of the medium. But before the cameras could truly begin rolling in earnest on the film's central story, Elizabeth's body intervened once again, this time in a crisis so severe that it nearly ended not only the production, but her life itself. In 1961, while still in London, Elizabeth developed a severe case of pneumonia. Her condition deteriorated with frightening speed, reaching a point so critical that doctors made the drastic decision to perform an emergency tracheotomy, cutting a surgical opening directly into her throat simply to allow her to keep breathing. For a genuinely terrifying stretch of days, newspapers around the world began quietly preparing obituaries. Her survival hung in real and serious doubt, and much of the public that had so recently condemned her as a homewrecker now found itself holding its breath alongside her. When she pulled through, something remarkable happened to public opinion. The transformation was almost immediate. This was no longer in the public imagination, the scandalous woman who had stolen Debbie Reynolds' husband. This was, instead, a young mother who had very nearly died, fighting for her life in a hospital bed with a tube in her throat. Fury gave way, almost overnight, to fear, and fear gave way just as quickly to a wave of genuine sympathy. It is a strange and telling fact about fame and public morality that death, or the close brush with it, has an almost unmatched power to rewrite a person's reputation. Elizabeth had come terrifyingly close to that particular rewrite. The timing of her recovery coincided, with an irony that feels almost too neat for real life, precisely with the voting period for that year's Academy Awards. Elizabeth had been nominated for her performance in Butterfield 8, a film she reportedly did not even particularly like, playing a role she felt only lukewarm about. Against the backdrop of her recent, very public brush with death, she won the Best Actress award. She was, by most accounts, refreshingly honest about the nature of that particular victory. She suspected, as did a good number of observers and critics at the time, that the award owed at least as much to collective relief and sympathy over her survival as it did to the performance itself. It was, in a very real sense, an Oscar awarded for simply staying alive, a strange thing to win, though given everything she had just survived, hardly an undeserved one. She carried the physical evidence of that ordeal for the rest of her life, in the form of a visible scar at the base of her throat where the tracheotomy had been performed. In an industry obsessed with flawless, unblemished appearances, she made the deliberate choice never to hide it, even in the most glamorous of settings. She wore it, quite openly, not as a blemish to be concealed, but almost as a badge, tangible proof that she had stared down death directly and walked away from the encounter. Restored to health, and at least temporarily restored to public favor, Elizabeth returned to the still-troubled production of Cleopatra, now relocated fully to Rome. And it was there, on that sun-drenched, chaotic film set, surrounded by ancient Egyptian sets and modern Italian crews, that she would meet the man who would come to define the remainder of her extraordinary story. His name was Richard Burton, a magnetic, hard-drinking Welsh actor with a voice frequently compared to distant rolling thunder, and a talent that, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely matched her own. Burton had come from remarkably humble beginnings, the son of a Welsh coal miner, one of 13 children, who had risen through sheer talent and force of will to become one of the most acclaimed classical stage actors of his generation. He possessed a towering, formidable gift for language and performance, an enormous personal charisma, and a personality every bit as large and appetite-driven as Elizabeth's own. He was also, like her, deeply flawed, a serious, committed drinker with what those who knew him often described as a poet's restless, unsettled soul. The chemistry between the two of them when it ignited on the Cleopatra set was immediate, overwhelming, and given that both of them happened to be married to other people at the time, extremely inconvenient for absolutely everyone involved. Elizabeth was still married to Eddie Fisher. Burton had a wife of his own, Sybil, along with 2 young daughters. None of these existing entanglements seemed to make the slightest difference against the sheer force of what was happening between the two of them on set. On screen, they were portraying the legendary lovers Antony and Cleopatra, and observers on set at the time frequently noted that the passion audiences eventually saw projected onto movie screens was not, in any meaningful sense, entirely acting. Off-screen, the affair caught fire with a heat that neither one of them seemed able, or particularly willing, to bring under control. Word of the affair spread with astonishing speed, quickly becoming a genuine global sensation. The very idea of 2 enormously famous, still married film stars conducting an open, unconcealed affair on the set of the most expensive film ever made proved absolutely irresistible to the international press. Photographers descended on Rome in enormous numbers. Every stolen glance between the two of them, every quiet dinner, every rumored argument became international front-page news. The Italian press, with a certain theatrical flair that fit the situation perfectly, coined a term for the entire spectacle, le scandale. The phrase captured with real precision the operatic, larger-than-life quality of the whole unfolding affair. This was not some quiet, easily concealed indiscretion. It was a full-blown international spectacle, unfolding in real time in front of the entire watching world. In a strange twist, the affair may have actually helped rescue the already troubled film commercially. The enormous publicity surrounding Elizabeth and Burton generated a level of public curiosity that no amount of conventional marketing could ever have purchased. People with absolutely no interest whatsoever in ancient Egyptian history suddenly found themselves desperate to see these 2 notorious lovers appear together on screen. The scandal, chaotic and damaging as it was in every other respect, became, almost by accident, one of the film's single greatest marketing assets. For Elizabeth personally, this connection with Burton represented something considerably deeper than yet another headline-generating romance. In him, for what may have been the first time in her adult life, she had found a genuine equal, a man capable of challenging her, matching her intensity and fire, and loving her with an overwhelming force that mirrored her own considerable capacity for feeling. It was passionate, volatile, and utterly consuming, the kind of connection capable of reshaping the entire remaining course of a person's life. Whatever else this relationship would turn out to be over the following years, it was, by every available account, genuinely and deeply real. An affair of this magnitude, between 2 people this thoroughly famous, could never remain a purely private matter, and it was about to draw public condemnation from some of the most unexpected and powerful institutional quarters imaginable. As the relationship between Elizabeth and Richard continued to dominate newspapers around the entire world, a publication associated with the Vatican itself published a public criticism of her conduct, an extraordinary moment in which one of the most powerful religious institutions on the planet found itself effectively issuing commentary on the romantic entanglements of a Hollywood film star. Around the same period, members of the United States Congress were reportedly heard grumbling about whether a woman behaving so scandalously abroad ought even to be permitted to return freely to her own country. It is genuinely difficult to overstate just how enormous this scandal had become. A woman had grown so famous that entire global institutions apparently felt compelled to weigh in on precisely who she was choosing to love. Let's sit with that condemnation a moment longer before moving forward, because Elizabeth's response to it tells us almost everything we need to understand about who she had become by this point in her life. The disapproval reflected the particular moral climate of the early 1960s, an era in which the open, unashamed, unconcealed affair of two still-married celebrities was widely regarded as a genuine threat to public decency, rather than simply a private matter between two consenting adults. Elizabeth and Burton were flouting the unwritten rules of the era openly, refusing to hide their relationship, refusing to offer any public apology or expression of shame. To the moral guardians of the period, this open defiance was intolerable. And yet, the louder these critics objected, the more attention they inadvertently drew to the very romance they were hoping to shame out of existence. What is most telling, and what says the most about the woman Elizabeth had become by this point, is how she actually responded to all of it. She did not grovel. She offered no tearful public apology, staged no carefully managed reconciliation with her existing marriage for the cameras, promised no reform of her behavior to satisfy her critics. Having spent her entire life, from the age of 9 onward, being told by studios, executives, and an endlessly opinionated public exactly what to do, whom to love, and how to conduct herself, she had arrived by her early 30s at a place of genuinely hard-won defiance. She wanted Burton. She had him, and the disapproving opinions of popes and congressmen, however loudly expressed, were simply not going to change that fact. This defiance came to define a great deal of her public image from this point forward, for better and for worse in the eyes of different observers. To her critics, she was shameless, a woman with no apparent regard for conventional morality. To her admirers, she was something closer to liberated, a woman refusing to be shamed simply for wanting love and pursuing it openly on her own terms. As is so often the case with complicated public figures, the truth almost certainly contained real elements of both. Having weathered this extraordinary storm of global condemnation together, Elizabeth and Burton eventually did the only thing two people this headstrong and this determined could reasonably be expected to do. Once each of them had formally freed themselves from their existing marriages, Elizabeth divorcing Eddie Fisher, Burton divorcing his wife Sybil, the two of them made their scandalous, globally chronicled union entirely official. They married in March of 1964, in a relatively small ceremony held in Montreal, and in doing so became, almost instantly, the single most famous married couple on the entire planet. Headline writers around the world quickly settled on a shorthand for the pairing that would stick for the rest of the decade: Liz and Dick. Theirs would prove to be a marriage of tremendous passion and equally tremendous volatility, a decade-long spectacle built from love, jealousy, extraordinary luxury, and legendarily explosive arguments. They made numerous films together, traveled the globe with an entourage worthy of visiting royalty, and both fought and reconciled with what those around them frequently described as genuinely operatic intensity. When the relationship was good, by all accounts it was truly dazzling to witness. Two brilliant, magnetic people who seemed to take real, unguarded delight in each other's company. When it was bad, it was correspondingly catastrophic, fueled in roughly equal measure by heavy drinking, considerable ego, and the almost unbearable pressure of living every single private moment under a permanent, unblinking global spotlight. The wedding itself, compared to the roar of publicity that had surrounded the relationship leading up to it, was a relatively understated affair. The marriage that followed, however, was anything but understated. Elizabeth and Burton became a genuine cultural phenomenon, a couple so relentlessly famous that virtually every one of their movements was chronicled in exhaustive detail, by a press and public that seemed to possess an almost bottomless appetite for news of them. The couple, for all their occasional public complaints about the intensity of the attention, also lived a life that quite openly invited exactly that level of scrutiny. They were glamorous, extraordinarily wealthy, deeply talented, and famously tempestuous. In short, precisely the combination of qualities the celebrity-obsessed public of the era found most fascinating. Professionally, the two of them became a formidable on-screen pairing as well, starring together in a string of films that traded openly and deliberately on their well-documented real-life romance. Audiences turned out in large numbers specifically to watch the famous lovers perform together, and the couple commanded enormous combined salaries as a result. Their various collaborations ranged, in critical terms, from genuinely excellent to fairly forgettable, but their combined star power at the box office was, for a significant stretch of the 1960s, essentially undeniable. Their lifestyle during these years reached a level of extravagance that is genuinely difficult to fully picture from a modern vantage point. They owned yachts. They traveled by private jet. They employed sprawling domestic staffs and moved through the world inside a bubble of luxury that ordinary wealth could scarcely begin to approach. One frequently retold anecdote from this period captures the almost surreal scale of their extravagance particularly well. British law at the time required that dogs entering the country undergo a mandatory quarantine period. Elizabeth, who adored her many pets and found this legal requirement completely unacceptable, arrived at a characteristically excessive solution together with Burton. Rather than leaving the animals behind or simply accepting the quarantine, the couple purchased a yacht specifically so their dogs could be housed comfortably aboard it, moored just offshore, technically outside British jurisdiction while remaining conveniently close at hand. Most people, faced with an inconvenient law, adjust their plans accordingly. Elizabeth Taylor, faced with the same inconvenience, simply bought a boat. Money during this period flowed outward from the couple with a freedom that bordered on the genuinely reckless, though given the truly enormous sums both of them commanded professionally, there was relatively little practical danger of it actually running out. Jewelry, fine art, property, extraordinary wine, and considerable generosity toward friends and family all flowed constantly from their combined fortune. It was, in the truest sense, excess treated as a way of life, a more or less permanent celebration that showed little apparent concern for any particular morning after. And no honest account of the Burton years would be complete without a proper, careful look at the truly legendary jewelry that passed between them during this period, a collection that would come to rival anything owned by actual European royalty. If there was one thing Elizabeth Taylor loved with an intensity approaching her love of people, it was fine jewelry, and Richard Burton, throughout their years together, proved more than willing to indulge that particular passion on an extraordinary scale. Among the most famous pieces he gave her was the Krupp diamond, a colossal stone of more than 30 carats, which she reportedly wore constantly and with remarkable casualness, treating an objectively priceless gem almost the way an ordinary person might treat a favorite, everyday piece of costume jewelry. There was also the pear-shaped Taylor Burton diamond, a genuinely enormous stone of nearly 70 carats that Burton acquired for her following a highly publicized international bidding war, a purchase that made global headlines in its own right given the eye-watering price involved. And there was La Peregrina, a historic pearl with a documented lineage stretching back centuries, having once belonged to the Spanish royal family. Unlike the two diamonds, this particular gift carried genuine documented history alongside its beauty, connecting Elizabeth, however loosely, to a line of actual queens who had worn the very same pearl centuries earlier. Elizabeth's relationship with these extraordinary objects reveals something genuinely meaningful about her character. Rather than treating pieces of this scale and value as investments to be locked safely away in a vault, she wore them, told stories about them, and by all accounts derived enormous, almost childlike joy from simply having them close at hand in her daily life. For a woman who had spent her entire childhood as property controlled and managed by a movie studio, there was likely something deeply and quietly satisfying about finally owning objects of this magnitude entirely on her own terms. Every one of these legendary gems functioned, in a sense, as a kind of declaration, tangible proof that the little girl once possessed outright by a corporation had grown into a woman who now possessed some of the most remarkable objects in the entire world. Yet, even at the absolute dazzling peak of the Burton years, with all their jewels and yachts and headline-grabbing extravagance, Elizabeth remained, above everything else, a serious and committed artist. And she was about to deliver what many critics and film historians still regard as the single greatest performance of her entire career, one that would permanently silence anyone still inclined to dismiss her as merely a beautiful woman draped in expensive diamonds. In 1966, Elizabeth starred opposite Burton in a film adaptation of Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, playing Martha, a bitter, blousy, middle-aged academic's wife locked in savage, unrelenting verbal combat with her husband over the course of one long, brutal night. The role demanded that Elizabeth abandon her vanity almost entirely. She gained a significant amount of weight for the part, deliberately adopted an older woman's posture and voice, and allowed herself to appear, quite intentionally, unglamorous on screen in a way that ran directly against the entire public image the studio system had spent decades constructing around her. For a woman whose public identity had rested so heavily on her physical beauty for her entire adult life, this was an act of genuine and considerable professional courage. She did not merely alter her physical appearance for the role, either. Elizabeth disappeared into the character of Martha with a ferocity that reportedly stunned even her most devoted admirers. The part required her to be cruel, frequently drunk on screen, deeply wounded, and savage by turns, trading vicious verbal blows with her on-screen husband across the film's long, punishing runtime. There was nothing conventionally attractive or flattering about the performance. It was raw, ugly in the most honest sense of the word, and painfully true, a portrait of a marriage in complete ruins that seemed, to many observers at the time, to draw at least something from her own considerable, hard-won understanding of exactly how love could curdle over time into open warfare. The pairing with Burton added an almost unbearable layer of authenticity to the entire film. Here were two people whose real marriage was itself already famously volatile, playing a fictional couple engaged in tearing each other apart on screen. The line separating performance from reality blurred in ways that gave the finished film an unusually jagged, electric charge that audiences responded to intensely. Whatever the true balance between acting and something closer to lived experience, the resulting performance was, by nearly universal critical agreement, absolutely mesmerizing. The significance of the Academy Award that followed cannot really be overstated. Her first Oscar, for Butterfield 8 several years earlier, had always carried the faint, acknowledged whiff of a sympathy vote, awarded in the immediate emotional aftermath of her near-fatal illness. This second award carried no such asterisk whatsoever. It was a victory earned entirely and unambiguously through the sheer quality of the work itself, a clear acknowledgement from her professional peers that Elizabeth Taylor was not simply a movie star who happened to be extraordinarily famous, but a genuinely great actress in her own right. She had proven it, beyond any reasonable argument, in the single most demanding role of her career. For Elizabeth personally, this achievement must have carried enormous meaning. She had spent her entire working life, from the age of 9 onward, being underestimated and frequently dismissed as simply a beautiful face who happened to be famous. With her performance as Martha, she answered every one of those doubters definitively and permanently. She had deliberately made herself appear older, heavier, and considerably less glamorous in the service of artistic truth, and she had been rewarded with the film industry's highest possible honor for doing exactly that. It stood, by most accounts, as the genuine summit of her entire artistic career, but summits, almost by their very nature, tend to be followed eventually by a descent. And the dazzling, headline-dominating partnership with Burton that had produced this extraordinary artistic triumph was also, slowly and painfully, beginning to consume itself from the inside. No fire burns quite that intensely forever, and the great romance the world had come to know simply as Liz and Dick began, slowly and then with increasing speed, to consume itself from within. The heavy drinking that had always been a fixture of their shared life together grew steadily more damaging as the years wore on, and alcohol, as it so often does, gradually began turning what had once been genuine passion into something closer to open cruelty. Their legendary arguments, which had once been reliably followed by equally legendary and passionate reconciliations, slowly began to feel less like the ordinary dramatic storms of a great romance, and more like symptoms of something far more seriously broken underneath. The decline was not a single sudden collapse, but rather a long, gradual erosion, the kind of slow wearing away of a relationship's foundation that can be almost impossible to notice from the inside while it's actually happening. The reconciliations came less easily with each passing year. The wounds, when they occurred, took progressively longer to heal. The relentless external pressure of their shared global fame never let up for even a moment, offering them no quiet private space in which to actually repair what was steadily fraying between them. Two enormous, formidable personalities, two towering professional egos, and two increasingly serious drinking problems, all of it playing out permanently on the world's stage, eventually proved to be a combination that not even a genuinely deep love could indefinitely withstand. They divorced in 1974. To much of the watching world, it seemed to mark the definitive end of an entire era, and in many important respects it genuinely was. And yet, neither of them could quite bring themselves to fully let go of what they had shared. The bond between them ran too deep, had shaped too much of who each of them had ultimately become, to simply be set aside. And so, in a gesture that was equal parts genuinely romantic and, in hindsight, fairly clearly doomed from the outset, they reunited and remarried in 1975, driven by the stubborn, very human hope that perhaps this second attempt might finally succeed where the first had not. It stands as one of the more quietly poignant chapters in her entire story. Two people who almost certainly understood on some level that they could not sustainably survive each other, choosing to try again anyway, because the alternative, a life spent permanently apart, seemed, at least in that moment, genuinely unbearable to both of them. The second attempt proved brief and largely unhappy, confirming precisely what both of them had likely feared all along. The underlying problems that had ended the first marriage had not simply vanished during their time apart. The drinking remained a serious issue for both of them. The fundamental conflicts remained unresolved. The deep, genuine incompatibility that had somehow managed to coexist alongside their equally genuine and profound love for each other remained fully intact. Within a matter of months, this second reconciliation collapsed entirely, and they divorced again, this time for good. The great operatic romance of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton was, at last, truly and finally over. And yet, in the more meaningful sense, it never really ended in either of their hearts. Both Elizabeth and Burton continued speaking of each other with real, enduring affection for the remainder of their respective lives, and it is widely believed among biographers, and those who knew them both, that Burton remained, in a very real sense, the great love of Elizabeth's entire life, the relationship against which she quietly measured every one that came afterward. Some loves, it seems, simply do not require a conventionally happy ending in order to become the defining relationship of an entire lifetime. Theirs was very clearly one of those loves, magnificent and genuinely impossible, in almost exactly equal measure. Reeling from this final, definitive loss of Burton, Elizabeth was about to take the single most surprising and unexpected turn of her entire adult life, one that would carry her away from film sets and glittering premieres entirely, and toward the far more sedate drawing rooms of official Washington. In 1976, she married John Warner, a serious, ambitious Virginia politician who would go on, in fairly short order, to be elected to the United States Senate. In marrying him, Elizabeth effectively traded the film sets and premieres of the entire world for the considerably quieter, more formal social world of American political life. For a period, she genuinely threw herself into the unfamiliar role of political spouse, campaigning tirelessly and energetically on Warner's behalf, and by most credible accounts, her involvement played a real and substantial part in helping propel him successfully into elected office. The marriage represented, in a meaningful sense, a genuine attempt on her part to construct a fundamentally different kind of life for herself, quieter, more grounded, and considerably less operatic than the exhausting, headline-generating existence she had shared for so many years with Burton. Warner was a serious man with clear political ambitions of his own, and Elizabeth, perhaps genuinely craving a measure of stability after the sheer turbulence of her great romance with Burton, embraced the role of supportive political wife with what appears to have been real dedication and effort. She proved, in practical terms, to be an extraordinarily effective political asset for him. Her enormous fame and personal charisma reliably drew large crowds and considerable media attention to Warner's campaign in a way that no conventional candidate's spouse could ever have realistically matched. Her actual contribution to his political success, though frequently overlooked in accounts of her life, was genuinely substantial. During Warner's Senate campaign, Elizabeth campaigned relentlessly on his behalf, appearing at a long series of public events across Virginia, personally charming voters, and lending the full considerable weight of her celebrity to his political cause. There is very little serious doubt that her presence and active involvement helped carry him successfully into elected office. She committed the entire weight of her fame to his campaign, and in the most direct and practical sense possible, it worked. In a very real way, one of the most famous women in the entire world had personally helped make her husband a sitting United States senator. But the victory itself contained, buried within it, the seeds of what would become a genuinely difficult and unhappy period in her life. Once Warner had actually been elected, he became almost entirely consumed by the demanding, all-encompassing daily work of governing in the Senate. Elizabeth, having effectively served her most valuable purpose as his dazzling campaign asset, suddenly found herself with comparatively little meaningful role to play, and with essentially no place left to genuinely shine in her own right. The woman who had spent literally her entire life, from early childhood onward, positioned at the very center of public attention, was now, quite abruptly, relegated to something closer to a supporting player in someone else's ongoing political story, waiting quietly at home while her husband attended to the serious business of governing the nation. The loneliness of this particular period in her life appears, by most accounts, to have been genuinely profound. Elizabeth was, in the truest sense, a creature of the spotlight, someone fundamentally built for performance, for connection, and for the particular kind of electric energy that comes from constantly being seen and known by an audience. Deprived of nearly all of that for the first extended period in her adult life, isolated within the comparatively formal, unfamiliar social world of Washington political society, she began, by several accounts, to genuinely struggle. There were no films left for her to make during this period, no readily available adoring public to draw daily energy from, no significant creative outlet whatsoever for her considerable natural vitality. The relative stillness that some people might genuinely crave in their lives functioned for her, it seems, as something closer to a slow, quiet form of suffocation. She coped with this profound sense of dislocation in ways that, in time, would deepen her difficulties considerably. During this period, by multiple accounts, she ate and drank noticeably more, and her weight increased in ways that drew unusually unkind commentary from a press that had spent literal decades obsessing intensely over her physical beauty. Behind the carefully composed, formal public images of the dutiful senator's wife. There existed, by all available accounts, a woman quietly sliding into a genuinely difficult emotional period, her famously formidable spirit considerably dimmed by a life that seemed, for the first time, to offer it almost nowhere meaningful to go. The remembered glamour of her earlier decades must have felt, during this period, very far away indeed. This particular unhappy chapter of her life could not realistically continue indefinitely, and in time, it did not. But climbing back out of it would require Elizabeth to confront a set of much deeper personal struggles that she had, in one form or another, been quietly carrying with her for most of her adult life. Struggles she would eventually confront with a degree of public honesty that few major celebrities of her era had ever previously attempted. By the early years of the 1980s, the chronic physical pain that had first taken root during that fall from a horse on the set of National Velvet nearly 4 decades earlier, compounded by years of genuinely hard living, had finally caught up with her in a way she could no longer manage or ignore. She had become seriously dependent on a combination of prescription painkillers and alcohol, trapped in a cycle that was, by every measure, slowly and steadily destroying her physically and emotionally. And then, in the early 1980s, she did something that for a celebrity of her particular magnitude was, at the time, almost genuinely unthinkable. She admitted it publicly. In 1983, Elizabeth checked herself into the Betty Ford Center, becoming one of the very first major American celebrities to openly acknowledge and seek treatment for a serious addiction, rather than following the far more conventional path of quietly hiding the problem behind carefully managed studio-style spin and denial. It was an act of considerable personal courage, and one that, in its own quiet way, helped chip away meaningfully at the deep shame and stigma surrounding addiction for countless ordinary people who happened to be watching from home. She would go on to struggle with these particular demons more than once over the following years, eventually returning for further treatment. But in consistently choosing honesty over the more comfortable path of a carefully maintained public image, Elizabeth once again managed to turn a deeply private form of suffering into something that quietly helped a great many other people. The roots of her addiction, its worth understanding clearly, traced back in large part to genuine, ongoing physical pain rather than simple recreational excess. Ever since that early fall during the filming of National Velvet, Elizabeth had lived with serious, persistent chronic back problems, and over the following decades, she underwent numerous surgeries and endured repeated injuries related to that original damage. The pain itself was entirely real and genuinely relentless, and the standard medical response of that era to this kind of chronic pain was typically a steady, ongoing supply of powerful prescription painkillers. What began, quite legitimately, as necessary medical treatment for genuine physical suffering gradually, and almost imperceptibly, evolved into a serious dependency. The very medications that had originally eased her physical pain slowly tightening their grip over other areas of her life as well. Alcohol compounded these underlying difficulties considerably. Elizabeth had been a genuinely heavy drinker for a great many years by this point, particularly throughout the Burton era, when a life built almost entirely around constant celebration, an equally constant conflict had been steadily lubricated by a more or less continuous flow of alcohol. The combination of alcohol together with prescription painkillers is, medically speaking, a genuinely dangerous one, and over time this particular combination wore her down considerably, both physically and emotionally. By the early 1980s, emerging from the lonely, difficult unhappiness of her Washington years, she had reached what amounted to a genuine personal crisis, with both her physical health and her emotional well-being in serious jeopardy. What she chose to do about that crisis was, for the era, genuinely remarkable. In a period when celebrities routinely went to extraordinary lengths to conceal exactly this kind of personal struggle, when the old studio system itself had spent literal decades carefully burying every unflattering truth about its major stars, Elizabeth made the deliberate choice to be transparent instead. She checked herself into treatment, and crucially, she did not attempt to hide that fact from the public. She acknowledged her addiction openly and directly, refusing the conventional shame and secrecy that the era's social conventions would ordinarily have demanded of someone in her position. For a woman of her considerable fame to publicly admit to being an addict was, at the time, almost entirely without precedent, a genuine breaking of a deeply held cultural taboo. The impact of that particular act of honesty extended considerably beyond the boundaries of her own personal recovery. By speaking openly about both her addiction and her subsequent treatment, Elizabeth helped meaningfully reduce the broader stigma surrounding these kinds of struggles for a great many ordinary people who had no connection to fame at all. If the most glamorous, most photographed woman in the entire world could openly admit that she needed help, and could seek that help without apparent shame, then perhaps addiction itself was not, as conventional wisdom of the era often suggested, simply a moral failing to be hidden away, but rather a genuine illness deserving of real treatment. A considerable number of ordinary people struggling silently with similar issues reportedly took real courage from her public example. It was, in its own quiet way, a genuinely significant form of public service, delivered simply through her refusal to keep pretending everything was fine. Her recovery, importantly, was not a single, clean, permanent victory, but rather an ongoing and at times difficult battle, as recovery from serious addiction so often proves to be. She would return to treatment again in later years, continuing to confront these same underlying struggles more than once, because addiction of this kind rarely, if ever, simply surrenders after only a single confrontation. But her sustained willingness to keep fighting, and her continued willingness to remain honest about that ongoing fight rather than presenting a falsely polished image of effortless triumph, was itself a genuine and considerable form of personal strength. She showed the watching world a real, difficult, and often messy human struggle rather than a comfortable fiction, and there was real power in that particular kind of visible truth. Emerging from this genuinely dark period of her life, Elizabeth was about to enter one of the most quietly meaningful chapters of her entire existence, one in which her considerable fame, her hard-won personal courage, and her famously enormous capacity for love would combine to make a difference that, in the view of many who knew her, ultimately dwarfed anything she had ever accomplished on screen. But first, one final and genuinely unlikely marriage awaited her. It was fittingly enough at the Betty Ford Center itself that Elizabeth met the man who would become her eighth and final husband. His name was Larry Fortensky, a construction worker with absolutely no connection whatsoever to the world of Hollywood, and the two of them formed a genuine bond rooted in their shared experience of recovery. In 1991, they married in a ceremony that, characteristically for Elizabeth, could belong to no one else. The wedding was held at Neverland Ranch, the sprawling private estate belonging to her close friend Michael Jackson, and it quickly descended into a media circus so intense that, according to widely reported accounts from the time, one particularly determined photographer actually parachuted directly onto the estate grounds in a desperate attempt to capture unauthorized images of the ceremony. The pairing itself was, on its surface, almost comically mismatched, and the press of the era certainly treated it that way at the time. Fortensky was a man who worked with his hands for a living, roughly 2 decades younger than Elizabeth, coming from a background about as far removed from Hollywood royalty as it was realistically possible to be. To many outside observers, the match seemed genuinely baffling, the kind of pairing that invited raised eyebrows and no small amount of unkind speculation in the press. But there was, underneath the surface incongruity, a genuine logic rooted firmly in the actual circumstances of how the two of them had met. They had encountered one another not at some glamorous industry premiere or exclusive Hollywood party, but at the Betty Ford Center, both of them there specifically to confront serious personal addictions. They had met, in other words, at a genuine moment of shared vulnerability, largely stripped of pretense, bonded together by the common, difficult struggle to reclaim control over their own lives. In a strange but genuine way, it was one of the more emotionally honest foundations underlying any of her 8 marriages, built not on scandal or public spectacle, but on mutual recovery and real, unglamorous human connection. The marriage itself lasted several years before eventually ending, like the majority of her previous marriages, in divorce. It was her 8th, and, as it would turn out, final trip down the aisle, closing out a matrimonial record that remains, even decades later, one of the most extensively documented in the entire history of celebrity culture. What the Fortensky marriage revealed more than anything else was something genuinely touching about her underlying character. Here was a woman who had been loved, over the course of her life, by some of the most famous and powerful men in the entire world, who had owned some of the most legendary jewels on the planet and commanded record-breaking salaries throughout her career, and who could nonetheless still open her heart, at a genuinely low point in her life, to an entirely ordinary working man she happened to meet in treatment. Her considerable capacity for love, however imperfectly it may have played out across 8 separate marriages, remained genuine and entirely unpretentious right through to the very end. But the deepest, most enduring relationships of Elizabeth's later years were not, in the end, romantic ones at all. They were instead the fierce, lasting friendships she maintained, and above all, the great humanitarian cause that would come to define the final meaningful decades of her extraordinary life. A cause she took up at a moment when almost no one else in Hollywood was genuinely willing to join her. Of everything Elizabeth Taylor accomplished across her long and extraordinarily varied life, this next chapter may well be the one she herself would most want remembered. In the mid-1980s, as the AIDS crisis began spreading with terrifying speed across the country, and as fear, silence, and deep prejudice gripped a large portion of American society, Elizabeth did something that almost no other major celebrity of her stature was willing to do at the time. She spoke up. She spoke loudly, without any apparent fear for her own reputation, and she refused to stop once she had started. To understand the genuine magnitude of her courage here, it's worth taking a moment to remember the actual climate of that period with some care. In the early years of the AIDS crisis, fear and prejudice ran rampant throughout American public life. The disease itself was widely and viciously stigmatized, and its victims were frequently shunned, isolated, and abandoned, sometimes even by members of their own families. A great many public figures, genuinely terrified of any public association with something so feared and so deeply entangled with existing social prejudice, chose to simply say nothing at all. Silence, for most of Hollywood at the time, was overwhelmingly the safer choice. Speaking up carried real, tangible risk to one's career and public reputation, and very few people in her position were willing to accept that risk. Elizabeth was willing. She had watched the unfolding crisis with growing horror and genuine compassion, and when her dear, longtime friend Rock Hudson, the very same Rock Hudson she had first worked alongside decades earlier on the set of Giant, became gravely ill and eventually died from complications of the disease in 1985, something inside her seemed to crystallize completely. Hudson's illness and death put a beloved, deeply familiar, famous face directly onto a disease that much of the country had until then been content to regard as distant, shameful, and safely abstract. Elizabeth resolved from that point forward to fight this crisis with absolutely everything she had. She would not remain silent while people continued suffering and dying quietly in the shadows of public shame. She helped found the American Foundation for AIDS Research, known widely as AMFR, lending the full weight of her enormous fame and considerable fundraising ability to the cause from its earliest days. Later, she went on to establish her own dedicated organization, the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, to continue and expand this same work. Importantly, she was never merely a passive figurehead lending her famous name to an official letterhead somewhere. She was, by every credible account, actively and passionately involved in the actual work itself, personally raising money on a scale that very few other individuals could realistically match, and deploying her considerable celebrity deliberately as a genuine weapon against public fear and institutional indifference. Doors opened readily for Elizabeth Taylor that simply did not open for almost anyone else working in this space, and she used that unusual level of access relentlessly and consistently on behalf of the cause. Her advocacy required genuine courage in the corridors of political power as well, not just within the entertainment industry. She personally testified before the United States Congress, demanding meaningful action and adequate funding at a time when the political will to seriously address the growing crisis remained, by most honest historical assessments, shamefully inadequate. She used her considerable public platform to directly shame powerful political figures into paying genuine attention to a crisis they had largely preferred to ignore, refusing to allow the widespread suffering to continue being swept quietly aside. Beyond the fundraising efforts and the congressional testimony, she also did something considerably quieter, and in the view of many who witnessed it, even more meaningful. She personally visited sick and dying AIDS patients, sitting directly beside people whom a great many others in society were, at the time, genuinely too afraid even to touch, offering them real comfort and basic human dignity at a moment when much of the wider world had effectively cast them aside. This was, by nearly every account from people who observed it firsthand, Elizabeth Taylor at her genuine best, and it revealed a depth of character that had, in truth, always existed quietly beneath all the glamour and headlines. The same fierce, protective loyalty she had once shown so vividly to Montgomery Clift decades earlier now expanded outward into a genuinely vast humanitarian mission. The woman who had once been publicly vilified as a home wrecker, mocked relentlessly for the sheer number of her marriages, and reduced by much of the press to little more than her physical appearance, proved herself, in this later chapter of her life, to be a person of truly extraordinary moral courage, someone willing to spend her considerable fame and her carefully built reputation directly on behalf of the despised and the dying. That same fierce, unwavering loyalty would go on to define another one of her most notable, and at times genuinely controversial, later relationships, her close and lasting friendship with Michael Jackson. Elizabeth's loyalty toward the people she genuinely loved was, throughout her entire life, essentially legendary, and it was arguably never tested more directly than through her devotion to Jackson. The two of them shared a deep and entirely genuine bond, rooted in an experience that almost no one else on the planet could fully understand from the inside. Both had been famous since early childhood. Both had been thoroughly adored and just as thoroughly dissected by the public and press for their entire lives, and neither had ever really been permitted anything resembling a normal, private existence. When Jackson faced serious public scandal and relentless media scrutiny in his own life, Elizabeth stood by him fiercely and openly, entirely unafraid of whatever criticism that public loyalty might draw toward her own reputation. She understood, arguably better than almost anyone else alive at the time, the peculiar loneliness that comes from being turned by the world into more of a spectacle than an actual human being. Her friendships, as a general rule throughout her life, were never casual affairs. She loved with real intensity, defended the people she cared about even more intensely, and simply never abandoned anyone she genuinely cared for merely because it happened to become socially or professionally inconvenient to remain publicly associated with them. In an industry frequently characterized by famously fair-weather loyalty, Elizabeth's genuine devotion to her close friends was a rare and authentic quality, and the people fortunate enough to receive it apparently never forgot the experience. The bond specifically between Elizabeth and Michael Jackson was rooted in this shared, unusual experience of having been famous from earliest childhood onward. Both of them had been thrust into the relentless glare of intense public attention long before either was old enough to genuinely understand what was actually happening to them. Both had, in meaningful ways, grown up functioning as commercial products as much as ordinary human beings, their respective childhoods substantially sacrificed to the demands of entertainment, their private selves perpetually subject to public invasion. In each other, they appear to have found someone who genuinely understood this strange, deeply isolating experience of having lived an entire life almost completely in public view from the very beginning. This shared understanding formed the basis of a friendship of real depth and genuine warmth between them. They spoke frequently, spent considerable time together, and by most accounts offered each other something genuinely precious and rare: the simple experience of being seen by another person as an actual human being, rather than purely as a mythologized public icon. For two people so thoroughly mythologized by the wider world, this ability to simply function as an ordinary friend to someone who truly understood their situation was, by all indications, precious well beyond measure. Elizabeth reportedly cherished this particular connection deeply, and Jackson, for his part, clearly regarded her with enormous genuine affection and respect, going so far as to host her 8th and final wedding at his own private ranch. When Jackson later became engulfed in serious public scandal and faced intense scrutiny and accusation, Elizabeth chose not to follow the path that so many others in his life ultimately took, quietly distancing themselves in order to protect their own public reputations. Instead, she stood by him openly and defiantly. She defended him publicly, expressed her own personal belief in him, and refused to abandon her friend simply because remaining visibly at his side had become genuinely costly and controversial. It was, in essence, the very same fierce loyalty she had demonstrated throughout her entire life, now directed toward one of the most heavily scrutinized public figures on the planet. This particular willingness to publicly defend a deeply unpopular friend drew real criticism toward her, as she surely understood it would from the very beginning. But Elizabeth had never governed the major decisions of her life according to public approval, and she showed no particular inclination to begin doing so at this late stage. She had spent literal decades being judged by a notoriously fickle public that alternately adored and reviled her, sometimes within the very same calendar year, and she had, by this point in her life, long since concluded that loyalty to the people she genuinely loved mattered considerably more to her than the shifting opinions of any given crowd. If the wider world chose to turn against her friend, her clear response was simply to remain firmly planted at his side, and to let the world make of that whatever it chose to make. This loyalty was, in truth, one of the genuinely defining features of her character across her entire life, from that early moment reaching directly into a car wreck to save Montgomery Clift, through countless later instances of standing by friends during their own personal troubles, all the way through to her devotion to Jackson in his most difficult years. Elizabeth loved fiercely, and she defended the people she loved without hesitation. And this particular quality earned her, in return, a depth of devotion from her close friends that was every bit as fierce as the loyalty she consistently gave them. Even as she poured so much of herself into these friendships and into her humanitarian work during these years, Elizabeth remained, as she had been throughout her entire life, a woman with a genuinely keen eye for reinvention. And in her later years, she would go on to transform herself once again, this time into a remarkably shrewd and enormously successful businesswoman. Never one to let her considerable fortune simply sit idle, Elizabeth reinvented herself once again in the early 1990s, this time as a remarkably shrewd businesswoman. In 1991, She launched a fragrance called White Diamonds, lending her name, her glamour, and her genuinely unmistakable personal aura to a perfume that quickly became a phenomenal, sustained commercial success. It sold in genuinely staggering quantities year after year, ultimately generating more overall wealth for her than a great many of her individual films had ever managed to produce, and proving decisively that the Elizabeth Taylor brand itself remained, if anything, more commercially valuable than ever before. She stands today as one of the earliest celebrities to fully grasp the commercial power of directly attaching one's personal image to a consumer product, effectively blazing a trail that virtually every major celebrity would eventually go on to follow in one form or another. It was, in retrospect, a quietly brilliant strategic move on her part. The little girl who had once been, quite literally, an asset owned outright by a movie studio had grown, by this later stage of her life, into a woman who now owned that same underlying asset entirely herself, monetizing her own considerable legend directly on her own chosen terms. The glamour that had once belonged, at least in significant part, to MGM and later to various other studios and institutions was now, finally and completely, entirely hers alone to sell. The underlying genius of White Diamonds lay in exactly how perfectly it aligned with everything Elizabeth had already come to represent in the public imagination over the preceding decades. She was, by this point in her career, essentially synonymous with glamour itself, with genuine luxury, with legendary jewelry, and a life of dazzling material abundance. A fragrance deliberately evoking diamonds and understated elegance was not, in this context, some random product simply slapped with a famous celebrity's name for marketing purposes. It represented more precisely a genuine distillation of her entire public image into a single bottled product, an essence of the broader Elizabeth Taylor mystique that ordinary admirers could actually purchase for themselves and wear. The underlying branding worked seamlessly, quite simply, because in every meaningful sense, the brand itself was her. The commercial success involved was both extraordinary and, notably, genuinely enduring rather than a brief fad. White Diamonds did not merely sell reasonably well upon its initial release. It went on to become one of the best-selling celebrity fragrances of all time, moving genuinely staggering quantities year after year, decade after decade, for the remainder of her life and well beyond it. The overall revenue it generated for her was immense, ultimately dwarfing, by most credible accounts, the earnings she had received from a considerable portion of her actual film work over the decades. Elizabeth had, in effect, discovered a source of personal wealth considerably more reliable and more consistently lucrative than the notoriously fickle business of making motion pictures, and it flowed from nothing more complicated than her own carefully cultivated name and image. What makes this particular business achievement genuinely notable, from a historical perspective, is precisely how far ahead of the broader industry curve she actually was. Today, celebrity-branded fragrances, cosmetics lines, and various other branded consumer products are entirely commonplace, functioning as a more or less standard component of virtually any major celebrity's overall business portfolio. But at the time Elizabeth launched White Diamonds, this represented genuinely pioneering commercial territory. She was among the very first public figures to truly understand and successfully exploit the enormous commercial power inherent in a celebrity's personal brand, recognizing clearly that her own fame constituted, in itself, a genuine asset that could be monetized directly and on a truly enormous scale. A great many celebrities in the decades that followed would go on to walk the exact commercial path she had originally blazed. There is a genuine and meaningful symbolism embedded in this particular final reinvention of her public persona, one that closes an important circle, running consistently through her entire remarkable life. Elizabeth had begun her public life as a child asset, owned and closely controlled by a major movie studio that profited directly from her image while she herself remained, in any meaningful practical sense, largely powerless over her own circumstances. She had spent her entire formative childhood years functioning as a valuable commodity managed almost entirely by other people. Now, in this later chapter of her life, she had become instead the sole owner and controller of her own image, monetizing her considerable personal legend entirely on her own chosen terms, for her own direct benefit. The commodity had, in a very real sense, finally become the proprietor. It stood as a quiet but genuinely real triumph of personal autonomy, decades in the making. This successful perfume business also secured her financial independence in a way that very little else in her life quite managed to achieve. No longer dependent on studios, on specific film roles, or on the shifting whims of an entertainment industry, notoriously inclined to discard women as they grow older, Elizabeth had built a genuinely lasting, self-sustaining source of wealth that belonged entirely to her alone. She had, in effect, outmaneuvered the very system that had once owned her outright as a child, successfully transforming herself from that system's product into a fully self-sufficient business figure in her own right. The shrewd businesswoman had, in the end, proven every bit as formidable in her own domain as the celebrated actress had once been in hers. As the years continued to advance, and her health gradually began its final, extended decline, Elizabeth could look back across a life of almost incomprehensible fullness and variety, even as the wider world slowly and reluctantly prepared to eventually say goodbye to a woman it had, in a very real sense, watched grow up in real time, directly in front of its own eyes. Her final years were marked by the accumulating toll of a lifetime of considerable physical struggle. The chronic back problems that had first begun with that childhood fall from a horse never truly released their grip on her, even decades later, and to these long-standing issues were gradually added the more ordinary, as well as some genuinely extraordinary, ailments that tend to come with advancing age, including the serious heart trouble that would, in the end, ultimately claim her life. She endured surgery after surgery across the following decades, her body functioning, in a very real sense, as a kind of long-running battlefield on which she had fought an extended, genuinely wearing war for the better part of 70 years. Through all of it, by most accounts, she retained her characteristic spirit, her sense of humor, and her fierce ongoing engagement with the causes and the people she loved most, even as her underlying physical strength gradually continued to ebb away. On the 23rd of March, 2011, Elizabeth Taylor died in Los Angeles from congestive heart failure at the age of 79, surrounded by her children in her final moments. When the end finally came, it came relatively peacefully, with her family gathered closely around her. After an entire life marked by such considerable noise and spectacle, such intense and relentless public drama and constant attention, there was something genuinely fitting about a quiet, private passing, surrounded specifically by the people who loved her most. The woman who had, in so many meaningful ways, belonged for decades to the entire watching world died, in the end, the way most ordinary people eventually do. In the presence of those who loved her, not primarily as a global icon, but simply as a mother, the global response to her death was genuinely immense, standing as a clear testament to just how deeply she had managed to weave herself into the broader cultural fabric of the entire 20th century. A great many people who had never actually met her personally felt, quite genuinely, that they had lost someone they had known well, because in a meaningful sense, they truly had. They had watched her entire life unfold gradually in public view, from earliest childhood all the way through to old age, a continuous and remarkably consistent public presence spanning the better part of 8 full decades. Very few human beings in recorded history have ever been so thoroughly known, so completely and continuously observed, across such an extraordinarily vast span of time. Her overall legacy genuinely defies any easy or simple summary, precisely because it was so extravagantly varied across so many different domains. She was a 2-time Academy Award-winning actress, widely regarded as one of the finest performers of her entire generation. She was simultaneously a genuine fashion and beauty icon whose famous violet eyes became a permanent part of popular cultural legend. She was married 8 separate times across her life, a matrimonial record that made her, fairly or not, something of a cultural byword for romantic drama and excess. She owned, at various points in her life, some of the most genuinely famous jewels on the entire planet. And she was, in her later decades, a committed and courageous humanitarian whose fearless AIDS activism genuinely helped change public attitudes and, by most credible accounts, helped save real human lives. Any single one of these various achievements would, on its own, have been more than enough to constitute a genuinely remarkable life. Elizabeth Taylor somehow managed to contain every single one of them simultaneously, within the boundaries of one extraordinary existence. But perhaps her truest and most lasting legacy is something considerably less tangible than any specific award, marriage, or piece of jewelry. Elizabeth Taylor lived her genuinely enormous life largely without apology, embracing both joy and considerable suffering with roughly equal intensity throughout, consistently refusing to be shamed into being anything less than fully and completely herself. She was, by any honest accounting, deeply flawed and thoroughly human, impulsive in her personal decisions and remarkably generous with her time and resources, foolish at various points in matters of love and genuinely heroic at other points in matters of compassion toward others. She demonstrated to the wider world, across the full span of her public life, that a person could be impossibly glamorous by any conventional measure and still, underneath all of that glamour, be genuinely and substantively good. That a person could stumble spectacularly and publicly, more than once, and still ultimately stand for something that mattered a great deal, both to herself and to countless others. The famous violet eyes closed for the final time in March of 2011, and the truly extraordinary life they had witnessed across nearly 8 full decades passed quietly into the realm of settled history. But the particular light those eyes had cast throughout her long, complicated, generous life, the glamour, certainly, but also the considerable courage, and above all the fierce, deeply loving humanity of the woman who existed behind them, continues, by most accounts, to glow steadily and undiminished across the passing years since her death. And so, at the very end of this long journey together tonight, we find her at last drifting quietly off into history. Elizabeth Taylor, the small girl with the strange, striking violet eyes, born in a foggy London suburb, who somehow, across the full span of one improbable life, ended up owning some of the most famous diamonds on the entire earth. Tonight, we followed her patiently through nearly all of it. The child star, raised almost entirely by a powerful studio that carefully monitored even her daily meals. The 8 separate weddings and the 7 different husbands who stood across from her at each one. The devastating plane crash that broke her heart in an instant. The emergency tracheotomy that very nearly ended her life altogether, and the 2 Golden Academy Award statuettes she ultimately earned through her own persistent refusal to remain permanently underestimated. We watched the wider public adore her, then despise her, then adore her once again, sometimes within the very same calendar year, and often driven by precisely the same crowd of people each time. And through every single scandal and through every genuine heartbreak along the way, she simply kept going, chapter after chapter, decade after decade. She loved, by most honest accounts, too hard and far too often. She spent lavishly, and she drank more than was ever good for her, and she apologized in the end for remarkably little of any of it. But she also once reached directly into a wrecked car to help save a dear friend's life. She sat quietly beside the dying at a moment when much of the rest of the world remained too genuinely frightened even to draw close. And she consistently turned her own considerable personal struggles into genuine comfort and quiet courage for countless complete strangers she would never personally meet. She was, across the full span of her extraordinary life, foolish and brave in more or less equal measure, generous nearly to a fault, and gloriously, stubbornly, unmistakably human, right through to the very end. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson tucked away somewhere inside all of that glamour, waiting patiently to be noticed. That a life does not need to be tidy, in any conventional sense, in order to be genuinely beautiful. That a person can stumble spectacularly, more than once in full public view, and still ultimately stand for something that matters. That being fully and fearlessly oneself, regardless of the surrounding noise, remains its own particular and lasting form of quiet triumph. So tonight, as you settle a little deeper into your pillow and let the concerns of the day slowly fall away from you, think for a moment of Elizabeth. Not the polished icon smiling out from the magazine cover, but the real, complicated, deeply human woman who existed quietly underneath that familiar public image. And then let those famous violet eyes close softly, one final time, and let yourself drift gently, peacefully, all the way off to sleep. Good night.